Name the only person in human history who deliberately got himself arrested by the Gestapo so he could be sent to Auschwitz on purpose, not captured by mistake, not betrayed by a neighbor, not rounded up in the wrong place at the wrong time, volunteered, walked into the street on a specific morning in September 1940, knowing the Germans were running a roundup, and let them put him on the train. You cannot name him. Almost nobody outside Poland can, because the man who walked into Auschwitz on purpose, who built a resistance network of hundreds of inmates inside the camp, who smuggled out the first comprehensive intelligence report on the Holocaust to reach the Western Allies, who escaped after nearly 3 years, who fought in the Warsaw Uprising, who returned home expecting to be killed and who was killed, was tortured into silence by his own countrymen, and then shot in the back of the head in a Warsaw prison basement on the 25th of May 1948 by a man nicknamed the Butcher of Mokotów Prison. His files were sealed, his name was banned. For 41 years, in the country he had nearly died for twice over, it was illegal to speak of him as anything other than a traitor. His wife worked as a cleaning woman in a Catholic orphanage. His children grew up not being told where their father was buried because nobody knew. They still do not know. His grave has never been found. His name was Witold Pilecki. Poland's chief rabbi, Michael Szudrik, would later write that when God created the human being, God had in mind that we should all be like Captain Witold Pilecki of blessed memory. The British historian Norman Davies wrote that if there was an Allied hero who deserved to be remembered and celebrated, this was a person with few peers. The British professor Michael Foot, in his 1978 book 6 Faces of Courage, named Pilecki one of the 6 bravest members of the entire wartime resistance movement anywhere in any country. And until today, most of you had never heard his name. That is not an accident. That is the point of this story. To understand Witold Pilecki, you have to start where every story on this channel starts, with the world that made him. And the world that made Pilecki was a world that no longer exists. A world that was deliberately destroyed by the 2 regimes that bracketed his life, the Nazis on one side and the Soviets on the other, both of which wanted Poland erased and Polish memory along with it. Witold Pilecki was born on the 13th of May 1901 in a town called Olonets in Karelia, in the far northwestern corner of the Russian Empire, near what is now the border with Finland. He was not born in Poland. He could not have been born in Poland, because in 1901, Poland did not exist. The country had been partitioned out of existence by Russia, Prussia, and Austria more than a century earlier. Pilecki was born a subject of the Tsar, in a town surrounded by frozen lakes and pine forest, the son of Polish parents living in internal exile. His father, Julian Pilecki, was a forest inspector. His mother, Ludwika, came from minor Polish nobility. Witold was one of 5 children. The family was patriotic, Catholic, and acutely aware of what they had lost. They spoke Polish at home. They celebrated Polish history in secret. They raised their children to remember a country that the maps no longer showed. The family moved back to Vilnius around 1910. Vilnius was, at that time, also under foreign occupation, but it was at least within the pre-partition borders of the old Polish Commonwealth. Witold attended school there. When the First World War ended in November 1918, and Poland was suddenly, miraculously restored to existence as an independent state for the first time in 127 years, Witold was 17 years old. He had spent his entire childhood as a Polish boy in a country that did not officially recognize the Polish nation. Now, overnight, that nation existed again. He did not wait to be called. The German army was still occupying Vilnius at the end of 1918, refusing to leave even after Poland's official independence. Witold and other Polish scouts formed self-defense units to push them out. The Germans finally left on the 31st of December 1918. Witold was among the boys who watched them go. He was 17 years old, and he had already taken up arms for a country that had only existed on paper for 6 weeks. 2 years later, in 1920, the new Polish Republic was fighting for its life against the Soviet Union. The Polish-Soviet War was the moment when the Bolshevik Red Army, riding the momentum of revolution, tried to push west into Europe. Pilecki, now 19,
served in the Polish cavalry. He fought at the Battle of Warsaw in August 1920, what Poles call the miracle on the Vistula, the engagement that stopped the Soviet advance and saved not only Polish independence, but in the view of many historians, all of Western Europe from Bolshevism. Pilecki was decorated for his service. In the years that followed, he tried to live a normal life. He married a teacher named Maria Ostrowski in 1931. They had 2 children, Andrzej and Zofie. They lived on a small estate in eastern Poland called Sukurcze, which Pilecki had inherited. He farmed, he raised dairy cows, he helped establish a local fire department, he painted, he wrote poetry. He was, by the accounts of his neighbors and his children, a quiet, deeply religious, civically engaged man who loved horses and his family and the land. His son, Andrzej, would later remember him as a brave soldier, poet, painter, accomplished horse rider, loving father, dairy manager, and community leader. For most of the 1930s, this is who Witold Pilecki was, a gentleman farmer in eastern Poland who had once served in the cavalry, the kind of man who in any other century would have lived and died in obscurity, the kind of man whose name would never have appeared in a single history book. And then it was 1939. On the 1st of September 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland from the west. On the 17th of September, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. By early October, the country had been carved in half between the 2 regimes that had spent the previous decade describing each other as their ideological enemies. Pilecki, mobilized as a cavalry officer, fought in the defense of Poland with his Ulan regiment. The regiment was shattered by the German advance. Pilecki and the surviving men kept fighting as a partisan unit until the fall of Warsaw at the end of September. Then, on the 9th of November 1930, with the war officially lost and the country occupied, Witold Pilecki and his commanding officer Jan Woldarkiewicz did something that almost no one else was doing yet. They founded a resistance organization. They called it the Tajna Armia Polska, the secret Polish army. It was one of the very first underground resistance movements anywhere in occupied Europe. Within months, it would grow into a network that fed directly into what eventually became the Armia Krajowa, the Home Army, the largest organized resistance movement in any German-occupied country during the entire war, anywhere, in any country. Pilecki's first task in the underground was unglamorous: recruitment, intelligence gathering, document forgery, hiding men whose faces had become known to the Gestapo. He was 38 years old, a veteran cavalry officer with combat experience, fluent in Polish history and Polish hopes, the exact kind of mid-level resistance officer who builds organizations from nothing. And then, in the summer of 1940, something happened that would change his life. The Germans, looking for a place to hold the steadily increasing numbers of Polish political prisoners they were arresting, repurposed an old Austro-Hungarian army barracks near the town of Oświęcim in southern Poland. The Germans renamed the town Auschwitz. The first prisoners arrived in May 1940. By August, the resistance in Warsaw was beginning to receive a strange and disturbing pattern of news. Polish men were being arrested in Warsaw and other cities. They were disappearing into a place called Auschwitz. And then weeks or months later, telegrams were arriving at the homes of their families. The telegrams were brief and identical. "We regret to inform you that your son, your husband, your brother died at Auschwitz of typhus, of pneumonia, of heart failure, of natural causes. They were dying too fast. The pattern was too clean. Too many young, healthy men dying of natural causes in the same place at the same time." The Polish underground in Warsaw began to suspect that something was happening at Auschwitz that the German telegrams were not describing, but they did not know what. They had no agents, they had no escapees, they had no information. The camp was a black box, and the men who went into it did not come out. Major Jan Woldarkiewicz, Pilecki's commanding officer, called a meeting of his senior staff to discuss the problem. They needed someone inside the camp. They needed an officer, someone trained, someone disciplined, someone capable of building a resistance network from nothing in conditions that were at that point completely unknown. They needed a volunteer because there was no way to insert an agent into Auschwitz by any normal method. The only way in was to be arrested and deported as a prisoner. The only way to get arrested and deported as a prisoner was to walk into a German street roundup and let them take you. And the only way to do that was to know that once you were inside, you might never come out.
Witold looked around the room. According to multiple accounts, his eyes settled on Pilecki. The major did not order him. He could not order him. This was not a mission any commander could give. He simply made it clear, with his look and his silence, that Pilecki was the right man. Pilecki said yes. I want to pause here, because I think this is the moment that defines everything else. This is the moment that separates Witold Pilecki from every other resistance fighter, every other Allied officer, every other documented act of courage in the entire Second World War. Hundreds of thousands of people were sent to Auschwitz against their will. They fought to escape it. They fought to survive it. They fought to tell the world about it after it was over. Witold Pilecki was the only one who walked toward it on purpose. He was a husband. He was a father of 2 young children. He owned an estate. He had a life waiting for him on the other side of the war if he could just keep his head down. He gave that up. He volunteered to go to a place from which the dead were already being shipped home in telegrams. He volunteered to do it under a false name, with a false identity, knowing that if his cover was blown, his real family could be punished, and knowing that even if his cover held, he would be one prisoner among thousands, with no protection, no rescue, no exit. He did it because somebody had to. That was the entire reason. If you are finding this valuable, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm this kind of deep research is worth showing to more people. Now, back to Pilecki. The plan was simple, and the simplicity was the point. The resistance would forge a false identity card in the name of Tomasz Serafiński, a real Polish citizen whose papers had been obtained somehow. Pilecki would memorize the false biography. He would learn to answer to the name. He would carry no weapons. He would carry no documents that could connect him to the secret Polish army. He would go to a known location in Warsaw on a day when a German roundup was expected, and he would let himself be arrested. The location chosen was the apartment of his sister-in-law, Eleonora Ostrowska, in the Szoliborz neighborhood of Warsaw. The date was the 19th of September, 1940. Eleonora knew what Pilecki was planning. She had agreed to host him, knowing the Germans would come. He could have hidden. He could have been somewhere else. He could have walked the other way when he saw the German trucks pulling into the neighborhood. He did none of those things. He waited in his sister-in-law's apartment, and when the Germans came through the door, he raised his hands. He was arrested along with roughly 1,800 to 2,000 other Polish civilians, almost all of them men picked up in the same sweep. The Germans took them to the Light Horse Guards Barracks, a holding facility in central Warsaw. Pilecki spent 2 days there, 2 days during which the prisoners were subjected to systematic beatings with rubber batons, 2 days during which the Germans worked through the crowd, trying to identify any resistance members, any intellectuals, any officers. Pilecki, posing as an ordinary tanner from Warsaw, kept his mouth shut and took the beatings with everyone else. His false identity held. On the night of the 21st to 22nd of September 1940, Pilecki and the other prisoners were loaded onto a train. The train went south. It crossed Poland in darkness. By morning, it had arrived at a railway siding near a town called Oświęcim in the Polish region of Silesia, now under direct German administration. The prisoners were unloaded. They were marched through gates over which an iron sign read Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free. Pilecki was processed. His head was shaved. He was forced to undress. He was issued a paper-thin blue and white striped uniform and a pair of ill-fitting wooden shoes. A guard demanded that he hold up a sign with his prisoner number between his teeth for the registration photograph. Pilecki, exhausted and disoriented, did not understand quickly enough. The guard punched him in the face and knocked out 2 of his front teeth. He was tattooed with the number 4859. From that moment, in the eyes of the German camp administration, Witold Pilecki no longer existed. He was Tomasz Serafiński, and Tomasz Serafiński was prisoner 4859. What Pilecki found inside Auschwitz in September 1940
was not yet the death factory it would become. The gas chambers had not been built. The mass extermination of European Jews had not yet begun. In autumn 1940, Auschwitz was a concentration camp for Polish political prisoners, with smaller numbers of German criminals and a few Jews who had been arrested for political offenses. The conditions were not yet industrialized murder. They were something almost worse, in a sense. They were murder by exhaustion, by hunger, by random violence, by exposure, by despair. Men were worked until they died. Men were beaten to death by kapos, the prisoner functionaries, often German criminals, who ran the work details with rubber truncheons and the encouragement of the SS. Men killed themselves by running into the electric fence rather than face another day. The death rate in the autumn of 1940 was already catastrophic. Pilecki later wrote, in the report he composed after his escape, that the game which he was now playing in Auschwitz was dangerous. He added that this sentence did not really convey the reality. In fact, he wrote, I had gone far beyond what people in the real world would consider dangerous. His mission, however, was not survival. His mission was to build a resistance network inside the camp, and he began almost immediately. The structure he created was called the Związek Organizacji Wojskowej, the Union of Military Organizations, abbreviated ZOW. He built it on the cell principle, groups of 5 men. Each cell knew only its own members. The leader of each cell knew the leader of one other cell. Information moved up and down the network without anyone knowing the full structure. If one cell was betrayed or tortured, only 5 men would be exposed. The rest of the network would survive. Pilecki recruited slowly and carefully. He looked for Polish military officers among the prisoners. He looked for men who had not yet been broken. He looked for men with skills, doctors, engineers, radio technicians, men who worked in the camp administration, in the kitchens, in the warehouses, in the medical block, anywhere they had access to information or supplies. Within months, ZOW had members in nearly every part of the camp. The goals of the network were specific, and they expanded over time. First, to raise the morale of Polish prisoners by sharing news from the outside world, smuggled in through new arrivals. Second, to share food and clothing so that members of the network could keep each other alive. Third, to gather intelligence on the camp itself, on its operations, on the SS officers running it, on the methods of killing being used and developed. Fourth, to smuggle that intelligence out of the camp. And fifth, in the long term, to prepare for an armed uprising of the prisoners if the Allies ever came close enough to support it. The first reports started flowing out of Auschwitz to the Polish underground in Warsaw in October 1940, just 1 month after Pilecki arrived. The method was simple and incredibly dangerous. Prisoners who were released from the camp, and in 1940 some prisoners were still being released, would memorize reports orally. They would walk out of the camp gates with the words in their heads. They would deliver them to the Home Army headquarters in Warsaw as an oral account of conditions inside the camp. Beatings, starvation, mass killings of the sick, the systematic murder of Polish intellectuals. In November 1940, just 2 months after Pilecki's arrival, the first written reports about genocide occurring at the camp were sent through ZOW channels to the Home Army in Warsaw. From March 1941 onward, Pilecki's reports were being forwarded from Warsaw to the Polish government in exile in London. From London, they were shared with the British government. They were shared with the American government. They were shared with the Allied intelligence services. From March 1941 onward, the British and American governments knew about Auschwitz in detail from a source inside the camp. They knew because Witold Pilecki was telling them. I want to lay this out clearly because the chronology matters more than almost anything else in this story. The first written reports about genocide at Auschwitz reached Warsaw in November 1940. The first reports reached London in March 1941. By the end of 1941, Pilecki's intelligence network
had transmitted detailed accounts of mass shootings, of medical experiments on prisoners, of the systematic murder of Soviet prisoners of war who had been brought to the camp specifically to be killed in the first experiments with poison gas. The first use of Zyklon B at Auschwitz, the gas that would later murder over 1 million people, was tested on Soviet prisoners of war in September 1941. Pilecki documented it. He sent the report out. The world was told. In 1942, when the systematic mass murder of European Jews began at Auschwitz on an industrial scale, Pilecki was there. He documented the construction of the new gas chambers and crematoria. He documented the arrival of the first Jewish transports from across occupied Europe. He documented the selections, the process by which arriving prisoners were divided into those fit for labor and those sent immediately to the gas. He documented the burning. He sent it all out. The reports kept flowing. In one of the most remarkable feats of the entire ZOW operation, Pilecki's network managed to assemble a working radio transmitter inside the camp from parts smuggled in piece by piece over 7 months. From that transmitter, ZOW broadcast reports on camp conditions and death tolls directly to the outside world. The transmitter operated until the risk of discovery became too high, at which point it was dismantled and hidden. Through it all, Pilecki kept his cover. He worked the labor details. He took the beatings. He survived typhus. He watched men die around him every day, and he kept building the network.
By 1943, 2 things had become clear to Pilecki. The first was that the Gestapo had begun to penetrate ZAW. Several of its most senior members had been identified and killed. The network was still functioning, but its core was under threat. The second was that the Home Army in Warsaw was not going to launch a rescue operation against Auschwitz. Pilecki had been hoping since 1940 that the resistance would eventually attack the camp from outside, while ZAW rose up from inside. The Home Army, after years of consideration, had concluded that such an operation was impossible. They had no air support, they had no transport, they had no way to evacuate tens of thousands of liberated prisoners through occupied Polish territory. The plan was a fantasy. Pilecki decided he had to escape. He had to get out of the camp himself, reach the Home Army leadership in person, and try one last time to convince them that an attack on Auschwitz was both necessary and possible. If he stayed inside much longer, the Gestapo would find him. The information he carried in his head would die with him. He had to go. He arranged a transfer to the camp bakery. The bakery was located outside the main wire, about 2 miles from the central camp. Bread had to be baked through the night, which meant the bakery operated when most of the camp was asleep. Pilecki recruited 2 fellow prisoners he trusted absolutely, Jan Redzai and Edward Sesielski. They worked together for weeks, planning every detail. On the night of the 26th to the 27th of April 1943, the 3 men made their move. They cut the telephone and alarm lines in the bakery. They overpowered a guard. They used a duplicate key copied from one of the regular keys to unlock the front door. They walked out into the Polish countryside in the dark. They ran for days. They moved at night, hid during the day, trusted nobody. They were hunted. The SS sent search parties after them. They were shot at. Pilecki later wrote that he believed they survived because they prayed constantly, and because, in his view, God had decided their work was not yet finished. In the first days of May 1943, they reached the town of Bochnia in southern Poland. Pilecki asked for contact with the local Home Army command. The contact was made. He met with the deputy commander of the Home Army for the Nowy Wisnitz area, who lived in a manor house in a village called Koresnówka. When Pilecki was introduced, he and the deputy commander stared at each other. The deputy commander's name was Tomasz Serafiński. He was the real Tomasz Serafiński, the man whose identity Pilecki had been using for nearly 3 years inside Auschwitz. Pilecki had been registered, processed, beaten, starved, and tattooed under this man's name, and now, by pure chance, he was standing in his living room. The 2 men became friends almost instantly. Pilecki stayed with Serafiński and his wife Ludmila at their home until late August 1943. The other 2 escapees hid nearby. During those months,
Pilecki began writing. The document Pilecki produced after his escape, eventually expanded into the version known as Witold's Report, was the first comprehensive eyewitness account of a Holocaust death camp ever delivered to the Allies by a single source. It described in detail that no one in the West had previously possessed the structure of the Auschwitz complex, the daily operations, the methods of killing, the gas chambers and crematoria, the selections, the medical experiments, the extermination of Soviet POWs, and the ongoing industrial murder of European Jews. The report stated that there were 3 crematoria in Auschwitz II, what we now call Birkenau, capable of cremating 8,000 people per day. Pilecki's earliest written report, from 1943, included an explicit appeal. He asked the Polish government in exile to ask the Allies to bomb Auschwitz from the air. The prisoners, he wrote, beg the Polish government, for the love of God, to bombard these warehouses. The logic was that an air attack would distract the SS guards long enough for the prisoners to overwhelm them and escape. Pilecki acknowledged that many prisoners would be killed in the bombing. Should the prisoners die in the attack, he wrote, it would be a relief given the conditions. Read that line again. It would be a relief given the conditions. That is what Witold Pilecki, who had been inside Auschwitz for 2.5 years, was telling the Allies. The prisoners would rather be killed by Allied bombs than continue to live in the camp. The Allies did not bomb Auschwitz, not in 1943, not in 1944, when American bombers were flying over the camp on missions to attack synthetic oil plants nearby. The reasons given have been debated for 80 years. Operational priorities, targeting difficulties, the risk of killing prisoners, doubt about the accuracy of the reports themselves. Some Allied officials, when Pilecki's reports first reached them, considered the descriptions of mass extermination to be exaggerated. They believed the numbers could not possibly be real. They did not believe the gas chambers existed at the scale Pilecki described. The reports sat in files in London and Washington, while the trains kept arriving at Birkenau. I want to pause on this because I think it is the most painful part of the entire story. Witold Pilecki spent 2.5 years inside Auschwitz, building an intelligence network whose primary purpose was to tell the world what was happening so that the world could stop it. The reports got out. The reports reached London. The reports reached Washington. The Allies received them, read them, and did nothing. The trains kept running. The crematoria kept burning. By the time the camp was liberated in January 1945, more than 1.1 million people had been murdered there, the vast majority of them Jews. Pilecki had warned them. He had warned them in 1941, in 1942, in 1943. He had escaped specifically to warn them in person, and the system that received the warnings did not act on them. Years later, Jack Fairweather, the British journalist who wrote the definitive English-language biography of Pilecki, would summarize this with a single line. Witold died believing that he had failed to deliver his message. He had not failed to deliver it. The message had been delivered. It had been received. It had simply been ignored. If you are finding this valuable, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm this kind of deep research is worth showing to more people. Now, back to Pilecki. By August 1943, Pilecki had reached Warsaw. The Home Army gave him a desk job in intelligence. He continued working on his Auschwitz report, expanding it, adding detail. He also joined KADIV, the sabotage and direct action arm of the Home Army, under the codename Roman Jezierski. He helped run operations against German targets inside the city. He gave money from the resistance to a woman named Barbara Neuerli, the Jewish wife of an author he had met inside Auschwitz, who was hiding in Warsaw and helping to protect other Jewish families. When a blackmailer threatened to expose Barbara Neuerli to the Gestapo, the blackmailer disappeared. Fairweather, in his biography, concludes that it is likely Pilecki arranged for his execution. In August 1944, the Warsaw Uprising began. The Polish Home Army, expecting the Soviet Red Army to support them, rose up against the German occupation in a desperate attempt to liberate the capital before the Soviets arrived and imposed their own government. Pilecki volunteered immediately. He served first as a common soldier in the Warszawianka Company,
of the Chrobry II Battalion in the northern city center, without revealing his rank to his superiors. He wanted to fight, not command. After many of the unit's officers were killed in the early days of the uprising, Pilecki finally revealed his true rank and accepted command of the 1st Warszawianka Company. He led them through some of the most savage urban combat of the entire war. The Warsaw Uprising lasted 63 days. It was crushed by the Germans, while the Soviet army sat on the eastern bank of the Vistula River, less than a mile from the burning city, and watched. Stalin had no interest in helping Polish patriots liberate their own capital. He wanted them dead. The Germans obliged him. By the time the uprising was crushed in early October 1944, roughly 200,000 Polish civilians had been killed, and the city of Warsaw had been systematically demolished, building by building, on Hitler's direct order. Pilecki survived. He was captured by the Germans at the end of the uprising and sent to a German prisoner of war camp at Murnau in Bavaria. He spent the final months of the war there. The camp was liberated by American forces in the spring of 1945. After his liberation, Pilecki made his way to Italy, where he joined the Polish Second Corps under General Władysław Anders. The Second Corps was the Polish military force that had fought with the Western Allies in Italy, including at the brutal Battle of Monte Cassino. Anders's army was made up of Polish soldiers who refused to accept the Soviet occupation of their country. They were loyal to the Polish government in exile in London, which the Western Allies had effectively abandoned at the Yalta Conference in February 1945, agreeing to recognize the Soviet-installed communist government in Warsaw instead. Pilecki was given an intelligence assignment. He spent the summer of 1945 in Italy, expanding and refining the Auschwitz report he had begun writing 2 years earlier. This was the version that would eventually become known as Witold's report. It was never delivered to the Allies in any meaningful way. By 1945, the war was over. Auschwitz had been liberated. The world had seen the camps. Pilecki's report, which might have changed history if it had been acted on in 1941 or 1942, was now a historical document. He completed it anyway because he believed the story needed to exist on the record for whoever would eventually read it. And then, in late 1945, he made the second decision that would define his life.
General Anders, by late 1945, was facing an impossible situation. The war was over. The communist government in Warsaw was consolidating power. The Polish Second Corps in Italy was, in effect, an army without a country. Its soldiers could not safely return home because the new communist regime considered any Polish soldier who had served under Western command a potential enemy of the state. Many of them were being arrested as soon as they crossed the Polish border. But Anders needed intelligence. He needed to know what was happening inside Poland. He needed to know how the communist takeover was being carried out, who was being arrested, what the resistance still looked like, whether the country could be reclaimed politically or militarily in the years to come. He needed agents on the ground. He asked for volunteers. The mission was to return to Poland under a false identity, gather intelligence on the communist government and the security services, make contact with the surviving anti-communist resistance, and report back. The volunteers had to know that they were almost certainly walking into a death trap. The new Polish Communist Secret Police, the Urząd Bezpieczeństwa, or UB, was hunting former Home Army members systematically. Many were being arrested, tortured, and executed. The leaders of the wartime Polish resistance, men like General Witold Pilecki, the last commander of the Home Army, had already been arrested by the Soviet NKVD and were dying in Soviet prisons. Witold Pilecki, who had a wife and 2 children waiting for him in Poland, who had survived Auschwitz, who had survived the Warsaw Uprising, who had survived a German POW camp, who had every reason in the world to stay in Italy or to emigrate to Britain, volunteered to go back. This is the second volunteer act of his life, and in some ways, I think it is even more astonishing than the first. When Pilecki volunteered for Auschwitz in 1940, he was a soldier in an active war,
doing what soldiers do. When he volunteered to return to Soviet-occupied Poland in 1945, he was a civilian veteran with a family who had already given his country more than any human being could reasonably be asked to give. He had earned a quiet life. He had earned the right to walk away. He did not walk away. Before he left Italy, he completed the final compilation of Witold's report. He told the people around him that he expected to be killed. He wanted the report to exist. He wanted his account of Auschwitz to survive him. He returned to Poland in late 1945. He used a false identity. He spent the next 18 months operating as an intelligence agent for the Polish government in exile, gathering information on the communist takeover, on the structure of the secret police, on the fate of his former home army comrades. He wrote regular reports and smuggled them out to Italy. He made contact with anti-communist resistance networks. He helped them document the Soviet-style purges that were beginning to sweep through Polish society. In early 1947, his superiors in the Polish government in exile rescinded his orders. They told him to leave Poland. The situation was too dangerous. He was too exposed. He should withdraw to Italy and continue his work from there. Pilecki refused. He believed his work was not finished. He believed the documentation he was gathering on the new regime was too important to abandon. He stayed. By the 8th of May 1947, the Polish secret police arrested him. The man who had voluntarily walked into Auschwitz, who had built a resistance network inside a death camp, who had survived 3 years of the worst the Nazis could do, was now in the hands of his own countrymen.
What happened to Pilecki between 1947 and his execution in 1948 is the part of this story that I find almost impossible to write about with the detachment I usually try to maintain. The Polish Communist Secret Police, the UB, was being run at this point by a man named Roman Romkowski. The interrogations were supervised by another man named Józef Różański. Both were among the most notorious torturers in the history of the post-war communist security services. The methods used in Mokotów prison in 1947 and 1948 were, by the testimony of survivors, comparable to anything practiced anywhere in the 20th century. The Polish writer Kazimierz Moczarski, a home army veteran who was interrogated in the same prison by the same men, later cataloged 49 separate types of torture he personally endured. Beatings with truncheons to the bridge of the nose, the salivary glands, the chin, the shoulder blades, the bare feet and toes, cigarette burns on the lips and eyelids, fingers being burned, sleep deprivation in narrow cells for 7 to 9 days at a time, accompanied by frequent blows to the face, a method the interrogators called Zakopane after the Polish mountain town because it produced hallucinations. Pilecki was subjected to the same regime. The torture lasted for months. The UB wanted him to confess to espionage on behalf of foreign powers. They wanted him to name his contacts in the underground anti-communist resistance. They wanted him to implicate other people so that the UB could arrest them in turn. Pilecki gave them nothing. According to his sister-in-law, who was permitted a brief visit after months of his imprisonment, Pilecki told his wife, in one of the only meetings they were allowed, a sentence that has become the most quoted line of his entire life. "I cannot live," he said. "They have killed me, because compared to them, Auschwitz was just a trifle." Read that sentence one more time. The man who had survived 2.5 years inside Auschwitz, who had been beaten on arrival until 2 of his teeth were knocked out, who had watched men die around him every day for nearly 1,000 days, was telling his wife that his current torturers were worse than the SS, and his current torturers were Polish. He still gave them nothing to protect the operatives still in the field, the contacts still hidden in the underground, the families still vulnerable to retaliation. Pilecki refused to break. He signed a confession that the UB drafted for him, eventually, after months of torture, but the confession was almost entirely fictional. He admitted to charges he knew were false. He refused to implicate anyone else. His trial began on the 3rd of March 1948 in Warsaw. It was a show trial in every meaningful sense of the term. The verdict had been determined in advance. The proceedings were a formality designed to legitimize an execution
that the authorities had already decided to carry out. Pilecki was charged with illegal border crossing, use of forged documents, failure to enlist with the new Polish military, carrying illegal weapons, espionage on behalf of General Anders and the Polish government in exile, espionage on behalf of foreign imperialism, which meant British intelligence, and planning to assassinate several officials of the Polish Ministry of Public Security. Pilecki denied the assassination charges. He denied the espionage charges in the foreign sense, although he admitted to passing information to the Polish Second Corps in Italy, which he considered to be the legitimate Polish military command in exile, and therefore not a foreign power. He pleaded guilty to the lesser charges, including the use of forged documents. The most painful detail of the trial, the detail that I think will stay with you long after you stop watching this video, is the identity of one of the witnesses who testified against him. The witness was a man named Józef Cyrankiewicz. Cyrankiewicz had been a prisoner at Auschwitz during exactly the same period as Pilecki. He had been part of a separate resistance organization inside the camp, the Socialist Resistance Group. Pilecki and Cyrankiewicz had not been close, but they had been on the same side. They had been fellow inmates in the same death camp, fellow members of the resistance, fellow witnesses to the same horrors. After the war, Cyrankiewicz had switched sides. He had become a senior official in the new communist government. By 1948, he was the prime minister of communist Poland, and on the witness stand at Pilecki's show trial, the man who had survived Auschwitz alongside Pilecki testified that Pilecki was an enemy of the state who deserved harsh treatment. I do not know what to say about this beyond the facts themselves. One survivor of Auschwitz testified against another survivor of Auschwitz to send him to the firing squad. They had both lived through the same hell. One of them had volunteered to enter that hell. The other one helped kill him afterward. On the 15th of May, 1948, Pilecki was sentenced to death along with 3 of his comrades. The court found him guilty of the major charges. Appeals for clemency were filed. Even some surviving members of the Auschwitz underground signed petitions asking for his life to be spared. The Polish president, Wiesław Bierut, refused to pardon him. The sentence stood. 10 days later, on the 25th of May, 1948, in the basement of Mokotów prison on Rakowiecka Street in Warsaw, Witold Pilecki was led to an execution chamber. He was 47 years old. The executioner was Staff Sergeant Piotr Śmietany, a man known among the prisoners as the Butcher of Mokotów prison. The method was a single shot to the back of the head, what was called Katyn style, after the Soviet massacre of Polish officers in 1940. According to multiple accounts of his final moments, Pilecki's last words were "Niech żyje wolna Polska," long live free Poland. Then Śmietany shot him in the back of the head. His body was taken away. It was disposed of without ceremony. The location of his burial has never been definitively determined. It is believed that his remains were dumped in an unmarked pit somewhere in the Połański Cemetery in Warsaw, in the section reserved for executed political prisoners, but no specific grave has ever been positively identified as his. In 2012, Polish authorities partially excavated the cemetery to try to find him. They did not succeed. To this day, the man who walked into Auschwitz on purpose has no known grave. His wife was not informed of his execution for some time afterward. His children, Andrzej and Zofia, grew up in communist Poland under a cloud of official suspicion. Their father was, according to the official record, a traitor who had been justly executed for crimes against the Polish state. The family lived under surveillance. Pilecki's wife worked as a cleaning woman in a Catholic orphanage. The children were marked as undesirables. They could not attend the best schools. They could not pursue careers that required political reliability. They lived with the knowledge that their father had been killed by the government and that the same government had erased him from history. For 41 years, in the country he had nearly died for twice over, Witold Pilecki did not officially exist. Mentioning his name in public was dangerous. Writing about him was forbidden. Polish historians who tried to research him were blocked at every turn. The first book about his Auschwitz mission, Józef Godlinski's Fighting Auschwitz, was published in 1975, but it was published in London in English by a Polish historian who had himself been a prisoner at Auschwitz and had emigrated to Britain after the war. It could not be printed in Poland. The first Polish-language biography of Pilecki, Wiesław Jan Wysocki's Rotmistrz Pilecki, wasn't published until 1995. It came out 6 years after the fall of communism. Pilecki had been dead for 47 years. In 1990, after the collapse of the communist regime, the Supreme Court of Poland reviewed Pilecki's trial and acquitted him of all charges posthumously. The verdict was overturned. The conviction was vacated. Pilecki was officially rehabilitated. The man who had been executed as a traitor was now, by official act of the new democratic Polish government, recognized as a hero. The honors followed slowly. In 2006, he was posthumously awarded the Order of the White Eagle, Poland's highest civilian decoration. Streets were named after him, schools, monuments. The Polish government has spent the past 30 years trying to make up for 40 years of erasure.
His Auschwitz report was finally published in reconstructed form in 2000, 55 years after the war. The first English translation appeared in 2012 under the title The Auschwitz Volunteer, Beyond Bravery. Jack Fairweather's biography, The Volunteer, came out in 2019 and won the Costa Book Award. It is, as of this video, the most complete account of Pilecki's life available in English. But for most of the English-speaking world, even now, Witold Pilecki remains a name that almost no one recognizes. He is celebrated in Poland. He is studied by Holocaust historians. He is referenced in academic books about the resistance movements of the Second World War. He is not in the popular imagination. He is not in the Hollywood films. He is not in the documentaries that play on cable television every May and November. He is, even after rehabilitation, even after the books and the awards and the streets named after him, the man you had not heard of until you watched this video. I want to end with the comparison, because the comparison is the point. When we talk about courage in the Second World War, we talk about a specific kind of courage. We talk about soldiers who charged machine guns. We talk about pilots who flew burning planes back to base. We talk about resistance fighters who blew up bridges. These are real, and they matter. The men whose stories we have already told on this channel: Maurice Rose at the front of his armored division, James Gavin first out of the airplane door, Matt Urban refusing to stop after 7 wounds. All of them embodied that kind of courage, the courage of the moment, the courage of the act. Witold Pilecki had that kind of courage too. He fought in the cavalry in 1939. He led a company in the Warsaw Uprising. He was not a man who hid from physical danger, but the courage that defines him is something different. It is the courage of the deliberate, sustained, unwitnessed decision. It is the courage of walking toward something terrible because someone needs to, of doing it on purpose, of doing it without anyone watching, of doing it knowing that the people you are trying to save may never know your name, and the people you are trying to warn may not believe you, and the people you are trying to serve may eventually be the ones who kill you. Pilecki volunteered for Auschwitz in 1940 because somebody had to find out what was happening. He could not know in advance that he would survive long enough to escape.
He could not know that his reports would be ignored. He could not know that the camp would not be bombed. He went anyway. Pilecki volunteered to return to communist Poland in 1945 because somebody had to document what the Soviets were doing. He could not know in advance that the security services would catch him. He could not know that he would be tortured. He could not know that a fellow Auschwitz survivor would testify against him at his show trial. He went anyway. When he was being tortured in Mokotów prison in 1947 and 1948, he could have given the UB the names they wanted. He could have implicated other people. He could have signed the confession the way they wanted it written and possibly traded those names for his own
own life, or at least for an easier death. He gave them nothing. He could not know that any of the names he was protecting would survive. He protected them anyway. When he stood in front of the firing squad in the basement of Mokotov prison on the 25th of May 1948, he could have said anything. He could have begged. He could have cursed. He could have stayed silent. What he said was, "Long live free Poland." He was about to be murdered by Polish citizens working for a government installed by a foreign power. He was using his last breath to insist that the Poland he was dying for, the free Poland, still existed somewhere, even if he could not see it. That is the courage that defines Witold Pilecki. Not the courage of one moment, the courage of every moment, repeatedly for 9 years, in escalating darkness, with no audience and no rescue, and no certainty of any kind that any of it would matter. And here is the thing that I keep coming back to. He died believing he had failed. He died believing his Auschwitz reports had not changed anything, that his warnings had been ignored, that his country would never be free, that the people he was protecting would be hunted down anyway, that everything he had given up his life for had come to nothing. He did not get the comfort of knowing that the Soviet Union would collapse in 1991. He did not get the comfort of knowing that Poland would become free again, properly free, 3 years after the Berlin Wall fell. He did not get the comfort of knowing that his name would be cleared, his rank restored, his story told. He did not get the comfort of knowing that Polish schoolchildren would one day learn his name in textbooks, and that his face would appear on commemorative stamps, and that the Polish government would one day acknowledge what had been done to him and apologize for it. He died in a basement in Warsaw, believing that the people who killed him had won. The Italian Holocaust survivor Primo Levi recorded a sentence that an SS guard once told him at Auschwitz. "However this war may end," the guard said, "we have won the war against you. None of you will be left to bear witness, but even if someone were to survive, the world will not believe him." Witold Pilecki survived. The world did not believe him. The world received his reports and shelved them. His own country received him and killed him. His name was buried for 41 years. But Witold Pilecki bore witness anyway. He wrote the report. He gave the testimony. He left the record. And when the world was finally ready to listen, decades after his death, the words were waiting. That is the story of the man who volunteered to go into Auschwitz, the Polish cavalry officer who walked into a roundup on the 19th of September 1940 because somebody had to, who built a resistance network of hundreds of inmates inside a death camp, who smuggled the first comprehensive intelligence on the Holocaust to the Allies, who escaped after nearly 3 years and wrote the report, who fought in the Warsaw Uprising, who came back to a Poland that was no longer free and tried to document the new tyranny that was replacing the old one, who was tortured by his own countrymen and refused to break, who said, "Long live free Poland," with the gun already against the back of his head, whose body was thrown into an unmarked pit, whose name was forbidden for 41 years, who has no grave, who died believing he had failed. He had not failed. He had simply lived in a century that was not yet ready for the kind of human being he was. Poland's chief rabbi, Michael Shudrick, wrote in 2012 that when God created the human being, God had in mind that we should all be like Captain Witold Pilecki of blessed memory. I think Shudrick is right, and I think the fact that almost none of you had ever heard his name until today is the most damning indictment of historical memory that this channel has ever had to deliver. That is the story.